The agency had told her almost nothing. A private residence in Beacon Hill, an elderly gentleman, classical piano, preferably Italian repertoire. The rate was 3 times her usual, which should have been a warning. But Mia Calloway had a rent check due on Friday and a checking account that made her stomach hurt every time she looked at it. So she had taken the job without asking the questions she should have asked. She stood now in the entryway of a house that was not a house so much as a statement, dark marble floors that reflected the chandelier. Overhead, like still water. Walls hung with paintings she recognized from art history textbooks. A staircase that curved upward with the quiet confidence of something that had never needed to prove itself. A man in a grey suit had opened the door without greeting her, checked her name against a list on a small tablet, and walked her through 2 sets of doors before leaving her alone in a room at the back of the 2nd floor. The music room was long and narrow, with windows that looked out over a garden going bronze in the October cold. A Bosendorfer, Grand, sat at the far end, its lid raised, its keys exposed, and Mia crossed to it the way she always crossed to pianos without thinking. The pull in her chest, automatic and embarrassing, like running towards someone who had not called your name. She set her bag on the bench beside her and pressed one key with one finger. The note rose and spread through the room and did not echo so much as settle. The acoustics in here designed for exactly this. And she understood without being told that this room had been built for someone who loved music, the way some people love a person helplessly and at great personal cost. She sat down properly and placed both hands on the keys without playing. The way her grandmother had taught her, listen to the piano first. Let it tell you what it wants, what it wanted. It turned out was the Siciliana from Bach's Flute Sonata in the arrangement Nonna Giulia had played on a second-hand upright in a Somerville apartment that smelled like coffee and cedar. Mia had not planned to play it. She had brought printed sheets in her bag safe. Professional choices. Chopin nocturnes and a Scarlatti sonata, but her hands found the Siciliana, the way hands find familiar things in the dark. And she let them go. The melody came slowly at first, each phrase careful and deliberate, and then the room opened around it, and Mia closed her eyes and stopped being a freelance piano teacher in a strange house and became, briefly, 12 years old and sitting beside her grandmother on a narrow bench while November rain came down outside, Nonna Giulia's hands over hers, the smell of her cardigan, and the words she always said at the end of the piece, not to Mia, not exactly to anyone, almost to the music itself. Low and private, rimani, stay. Mia said it out loud without meaning to. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the word dissolving into the last chord's resonance, and she did not realize she had spoken at all until she heard the silence change behind her. She turned. The man in the doorway was tall, and had been taller. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the frame of him, the architecture of a body that had once occupied space differently. He was 70, perhaps older, with white hair swept back from a face that had been handsome once and was now something harder and more permanent. The way certain landscapes are beautiful, not in spite of their severity, but because of it. He wore a dark suit with no tie, his collar open, and he held a glass of water in one hand that he was no longer paying attention to. He was looking at her the way people look at something they had given up, believing they would ever see again, not with joy, not with grief, but with a kind of arrested stillness, as though the ordinary machinery of his face had simply stopped. Mia stood up from the bench too quickly, and the piano bench scraped against the floor, and she said, "I'm sorry. I should have waited. I'm Mia Calloway, from the Harmon Agency. I was told to come at 3. And she was aware that she was talking too fast, and that this man was not listening to a single word she was saying. He was still looking at her with that expression she did not have a name for yet, and the glass of water was tilting slightly in his hand, and she was about to say something else when he blinked. Once. slowly, and the mask came back. It was not an ordinary mask. Most people wore expressions that shifted and softened depending on who was in the room. This man wore something that had been forged rather than learned, the product of decades of practice at revealing nothing. She watched it settle over his features like a visor lowering, and in the space of 2 seconds, he was simply an elderly man standing in a doorway, composed, unhurried, giving nothing away. But she had seen the moment before. She had seen him not composed. She filed it without knowing why. The way she filed things that seemed important before she understood their importance. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was low and carried a trace of an accent she placed somewhere in southern Italy. Naples, perhaps, worn smooth with years until only the shape of it remained. He walked to the armchair near the window, not the bench, not anywhere near the piano, and sat down with the particular care of someone managing an old injury or an old habit of restraint. She could not tell which. He set the glass on the small table beside him and looked at her steadily. "Sit down." She sat. The bench was harder than she remembered. "Play it again," he said. Mia looked at him. He was not looking at the piano. He was looking out the window at the garden, at the bronze-leaved trees, standing very still in the grey afternoon, and his profile offered her nothing at all, not explanation, not warmth, not any of the social lubrication that people usually provided when they were asking something of a stranger, just the words, flat and direct, and beneath them something she felt rather than heard, a frequency too low for the sentence itself to carry. She turned back to the piano. She played the Siciliana again from the beginning, and this time she did not close her eyes. She watched her hands and listened to the room and was intensely aware of the man behind her, not moving, not making a sound, the quality of his attention unlike any audience she had ever played for. Most people who listened to music listened to the music. He was listening to something else. She played through to the end, and when the last chord faded, she sat with her hands in her lap and waited. The silence lasted long enough that she began to wonder if she should say something, offer her credentials, explain her teaching philosophy, ask what kind of instruction he was looking for. She had been told she was here to teach. She had been given no other information. You play like someone who learned on an instrument that needed to be treated carefully, he said at last. Still, without looking at her, not a good piano, a piano that required consideration. Mia's hands went still in her lap. It was, objectively, the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to her about her playing, and she had been playing for 20 years. "My grandmother's," she said, "an old Yamaha upright, 3 of the pedals stuck." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a single leaf detached from the nearest tree and fell without hurry. "Where was she from?" he asked. "Your grandmother." The question was careful. Not where did she live, not where did she grow up, but where was she from? The specific weight of the phrasing landing somewhere between curiosity and something older, more guarded. "She always said Boston," Mia said, "but I found letters after she died, in Italian." She paused. "I think she was from Naples. Originally, she never talked about it." The man turned his head and looked at her for the first time since sitting down, directly, fully. The way he had looked at her when he first walked through the door, that same arrested quality. The machinery stopped, but there was something added now, something she had no word for, a light behind the mask that the mask was no longer quite containing. "What was her name?" he said. Mia opened her mouth to answer, and then, without knowing why, did not. Something in the way he asked the stillness of it. The too measured calm pressed against the edge of her instinct, and she said instead, "Carefully, why do you ask?" The silence after that was different from the one before it. Longer, more complicated. He looked at her for another moment, and then the mask reset completely. Smoother this time. Deliberate. No reason. he said. "Come back Thursday. Same time." He stood. The conversation was over. He left the room without looking at her again. And Mia sat on the bench alone in the long room with the Bosendorfer and the bronze garden outside, and understood, with a particular clarity that comes before you have enough information to actually understand anything, that she had just walked into the middle of something she did not yet have a name for. She picked up her bag and left. In the entryway, the man in the grey suit appeared from nowhere and showed her out without speaking. The front door closed behind her with a weight that she felt in her sternum. She stood on the Beacon Hill sidewalk in the October cold and looked at her phone, at the notification for a rent payment, at the contact saved as Human Agency, and then she put her phone in her pocket and walked toward the T station. She was already planning what to play on Thursday. Dominic Ferrante did not like surprises. He had spent the better part of 15 years engineering his life so that surprises did not happen, hiring the right people, building the right systems, making certain that information moved toward him before events did. So when his head of security, a quiet man named Richie, set a thin folder on his desk on a Tuesday morning and said, "Your father has a visitor, a regular one," Dominic did not react visibly. He opened the folder. He read the single page inside. He closed it again and looked out the window at the grey Boston skyline and said nothing for long enough that Richie shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "How many times?" Dominic asked. 3 sessions. Tuesday. Thursday. Tuesday. She comes at 3. Leaves before 5. The staff says your father requested her return each time. Dominic turned the folder over. He requested. Yes. The word sat between them. Lorenzo Ferrante had not requested anything from anyone in 4 years. Not since the last of his old associates had retired and the house had grown quiet around him. He ate the meals that were prepared. He walked the garden when the weather permitted. He sat in the music room, a room Dominic had not entered in a decade, and did whatever it was he did in there alone. He did not request, pull everything on her. Dominic said, work, history, family background, to finance, who referred her to the Harmon Agency, and who at the agency made the placement. He paused, and find out who she talked to before she came to the house. Richie nodded and left. Dominic picked up the folder again and looked at the photograph inside a candid shot from a security camera. Grainy, taken as she came down the front steps. Young, mid-20s, dark coat, bag over one shoulder. Looking at her phone, she did not look like a threat. She looked like someone trying to remember if she had left the stove on. He had learned a long time ago that this meant nothing. He went to the house on Thursday. He did not announce himself. He came through the side entrance that the household staff used, which meant the man in the grey suit whose name was Enzo and who had been with the family for 22 years looked up from his station with an expression of mild surprise that he immediately corrected to neutrality. Dominic said nothing, walked past him, and took the back stairs to the second floor. He could hear the piano before he reached the landing. He stopped in the hallway outside the music room door, which was slightly ajar, and stood with his back against the wall and his hands in his coat pockets. She was playing something he did not recognize, slow and intricate, the kind of piece that required patience from both the player and the listener. He was not a patient man by nature. He had trained himself into it the way he had trained himself into most useful things through repetition and necessity, but he did not love it. He waited. The piece ended and there was a brief silence, and then she said something he could not hear, and his father said, in a voice Dominic had not heard him use in years, something that sounded like a question, and she laughed, low and unguarded, the laugh of someone not performing anything for anyone. And Dominic felt something shift in his chest that he did not examine. He came around the door. She was still sitting at the bench, turned slightly toward his father's chair, and Lorenzo was looking at her with an expression Dominic catalogued and filed away with the same automatic efficiency he applied to everything open. His father's face was open, in 71 years, in Dominic's memory. Lorenzo Ferrante's face had been many things controlled. Severe, occasionally frightening. Once or twice in Dominic's early childhood, something approaching warm, but it had never been open. Not like this. Not unguarded. Dominic, Lorenzo said, not surprised, not particularly welcoming, just acknowledging. The way one acknowledges weather. The woman turned. Up close, she was different from the security photograph, less anonymous, more present, with dark eyes that moved to him and assessed him quickly, and then did not look away, the way most people looked away from him. She held his gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, and then she said, "You must be the son," with a tone that was perfectly neutral, and somehow still managed to convey that she had already formed an opinion of him that she was choosing not to share. "Mia Calloway," he said, not a question. "That's me. I'd like a word with you." He looked at his father, privately. Lorenzo made no move to leave his own room. He looked at Dominic with the same mild, impenetrable expression he had worn since Dominic was a child, the one that meant he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up to the decision. "Miss Calloway stays until 5, he said. "We're not finished." The sentence was simple. It was also the longest unprompted statement Dominic had heard his father make to him in 4 years. And it was not about him. He kept his face even. 5 minutes, he said to the woman, downstairs. He did not wait for her agreement. He went back down to the small sitting room off the main hall and stood by the window with his arms crossed and waited. She came down in less than 2 minutes, which told him she was either confident or curious or both. And she came into the room without hesitation and stood 3 feet from him with her bag strap over her shoulder, like she was ready to leave at any moment, and stopped there and looked at him. "How did you find this placement?" he asked. "Through the Harmon Agency. I'm registered with them as a freelance instructor." "Who referred you specifically to this household?" She blinked. "The agency matched me to the posting. I don't know who posted it." "And you did no research on the family before accepting?" Something shifted in her expression, not guilt, not fear. Something closer to irritation. The kind that comes from a reasonable person being asked an unreasonable question. "I researched the address," she said. "I checked that the agency had verified the client. I didn't run a background check on my student, if that's what you're asking. Because that's not something piano teachers typically do. Things that are typical aren't always safe." "I appreciate the philosophy," she said, and her voice was very measured. "But I'm not sure what you're implying. And I think if you want to have a direct conversation with me, you should probably just have it." He looked at her for a moment. Most people did not say things like that to him. The ones who did fell into 2 categories: people who did not know who he was, and people who did know and had decided to be reckless. She was in the first category. He was certain of it. And that certainty was the only thing keeping this conversation from going somewhere else. "My father is a private man," he said. "He does not receive visitors. Whatever relationship you believe you've developed with him over 3 sessions, I'd encourage you to keep it professional and limited. I'm his piano teacher," she said. "That's already the definition of professional and limited. Then you won't have any trouble maintaining it." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Ferrante," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and she said it like a period at the end of a sentence. "Your father asked me to come back Thursday. I came back Thursday. He's asked me to come back next Tuesday. I intend to come back next Tuesday. Because I was hired to do a job, and the person I was hired to work with seems to want me here." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "If you'd like to cancel the contract, you can do that through the agency. Otherwise, I have 40 minutes left in today's session." She left the room. He heard her on the stairs. Dominic stood at the window and looked out at the front street. at the parked cars and the afternoon light going flat and grey between the brownstones. He pulled out his phone and called Ricci. "How fast can you get me her full file?" he said when Ricci picked up. "I want financials. I want family history back 2 generations. I want to know if she's had any contact with Marco's people or anyone associated with the Vitello network. I can have a preliminary by tonight," Ricci said. "Make it this afternoon." He hung up. From above him, faint and unhurried through the ceiling of the old house, the piano started again. A different piece this time, something slower, more deliberate, with a patience in it that the previous one had not had. He stood and listened to it without meaning to. The way you register a smell before you identify it. The way something reaches you before your defenses do. And below the music, barely audible, the low sound of his father's voice saying something, not words he could make out, just the tone, a tone he had not heard from that man in 20 years, something that might, in another life, have been called ease. He put on his coat and let himself out through the side entrance, and he did not look up at the music room windows as he walked to the car, but he stood beside the car for a moment longer than he needed to before getting in, one hand on the roof, and the piano kept playing above him in the grey October afternoon. And he told himself the feeling in his chest was suspicion. He was experienced enough to know it was not only that. She found the photograph by accident, the way she found most things that mattered. It was the 2nd Tuesday of November, the 6th session, and Lorenzo had asked her to play through the Neapolitan songs she had been arranging, old ones, the kind that required more feeling than technique, which was either the easiest or the hardest kind, depending on the day. She had finished the 3rd song and reached across the piano to move her sheet music and knocked a small framed photograph off the narrow ledge behind the music stand where it had been standing, half hidden by the raised lid. It fell face up on the keys with a soft clatter, and she picked it up automatically and looked at it before she thought to set it aside without looking. The woman in the photograph was young, 19, 20, at most, standing on a seawall with the sea behind her. Very blue. The kind of blue that meant southern Italy in summer. She wore a white cotton dress and her dark hair was loose, and she was not posing. She had turned toward the camera mid-motion, mid-sentence perhaps, and the expression on her face was one of those unrepeatable expressions that cameras sometimes catch fully alive, completely unguarded, laughing at something just outside the frame. The photograph was black and white, but the light in it was so specific that Mia could feel the heat of it. She could feel the salt in the air. Her hands went still. She knew this woman. Not from life. The woman in the photograph had been dead for 4 years and had been old for 20 years before that. But from a shoebox in the back of a closet in Somerville. From the handful of photographs Nonna Giulia had kept, which Mia had looked at so many times in the years since her grandmother's death, that she had memorized them the way you memorize a piece of music. Every note in its exact place, the angle of the jaw, the particular way the eyes caught light, the posture, upright and unself-conscious. The posture of a woman who had never in her life been unsure that she had a right to stand exactly where she was standing. Mia had that posture too. Her mother had told her once. She had always thought it was coincidence. She set the photograph on the piano keys and looked at it for a long moment and did not play. "Miss Calloway," Lorenzo said from his chair. His voice was even, but she had been coming here long enough to hear the things underneath the evenness, the slight tightening, the particular quality of attention. He had seen her stop. "I'm sorry," she said. She picked up the photograph and turned it over in her hands so she was not looking at the face. "I knocked this off the ledge. I didn't mean to look at it." He said nothing. She set it back on the ledge, face down this time, and placed her hands on the keys. She played the 4th Neapolitan song through to the end without stopping. And when she finished, she gathered her music and said good night. And Lorenzo said good night. And she did not ask him about the photograph. She was not ready yet to ask him about the photograph. She needed to go home first, and be certain she was not inventing something out of longing and coincidence, which was a thing she knew she was capable of. She took the tea back to Cambridge and went directly to the closet shelf where she kept the wooden box her grandmother had left her. It was a small box, tidar, with a brass latch that had gone green with age, and it contained the things Nonna Julia had considered worth keeping: 7 photographs, a string of coral beads, 2 folded letters in Italian tied with kitchen twine, a child's drawing that Mia had made when she was 4, and a small notebook with a water-damaged cover that Mia had always taken for a recipe book because the first dozen pages were recipes: minestra, a ragout, a fig tart, and she had never gone past them. She opened the notebook past the recipes now, past the page where the recipes stopped and the handwriting changed, became smaller and more pressed, the writing of someone trying to put a great deal into a limited space. And she sat on the floor of her closet with her back against the wall and her coat still on and read. The early entries were undated and fragmentary, more impressionistic than narrative, the writing of someone who had not intended an audience. There were descriptions of a city she gradually understood was Naples' specific streets, the smell of a particular market, the light in November coming down over the bay. There were descriptions of music, of a concert hall, of learning to play properly for the first time on a decent instrument, and then, beginning partway through the second section of the notebook, there were entries about a man. He was never named, only ever L. But the entries about him were different from the rest, longer, more careful, as though her grandmother had tried to write him accurately, had felt the inadequacy of approximation. He was described as someone who listened the way most people did not listen, who heard music the way it was meant to be heard. She wrote, "He is not a gentle man, but he is a precise one, which I think I prefer." She wrote, "When he is in the room becomes smaller in a way that is not unpleasant." She wrote, near the end of the notebook, in an entry that was dated and whose date placed it 31 years ago, "They have made it clear what will happen if I stay. L does not know this. I will not tell him. If I tell him, he will try to stop it, and then something worse will happen. Something I cannot let happen. I am taking what I can carry. I am leaving the rest." The last line of the entry, separated from the rest by a space, read simply, "Rimani. Amore." But I cannot. Mia sat on the closet floor for a long time after that. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. She did not recognize the number. She let it ring through and then it rang again immediately, which was the only reason she picked it up. Miss Calloway. The voice was Dominic's. She knew it without being told. Low and without preamble, carrying the particular quality of someone accustomed to people answering when he called. "I need to speak with you. Tonight, if possible. It's 9:30, she said. "I'm aware. How did you get this number?" A pause that was not apologetic. "My people have been thorough. I'd rather explain in person. There's something I need to ask you and it can't wait." Before she could answer, he said, "I'll come to you. Give me the address." She looked down at the notebook, open in her lap, at her grandmother's handwriting on the last page, at the word Rimani pressed into the paper by a pen held by hands that had been gone for 4 years. She thought about the photograph. She thought about the Siciliana and the way Lorenzo Ferrante had gone still in a doorway, as if the floor had shifted under him. She thought about all the things her grandmother had never talked about, and all the things Lorenzo had never talked about, and the particular shape of those 2 silences, and how they were. She was beginning to understand. Exactly the same shape. "No," she said. Another pause, different from the first. "No. You don't get to call me at 9:30 and ask for my address," she said. "If you want to talk to me, tell me where and when, and I'll decide if I'm going." She heard him breathe in slowly. "And don't send anyone to follow me. I'll know." She would not know. She had no way of knowing. but she said it with enough certainty that the silence that followed was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Tomorrow," he said. "Finally. Noon. There's a restaurant on Newbury Street called Valdano. I'll have a table." She wrote down the name on the back of her hand and hung up. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and thought about her grandmother at 19 standing on a seawall in the summer light, and about the man who had taken that photograph, and about what it meant to love someone precisely enough to leave them without saying why. In the morning she showered and dressed and found the photograph from the wooden box, the one of her grandmother she had always loved best, the one where she was older, maybe 30, standing in a garden somewhere, still with that posture, still with that look, and put it in her coat pocket. She arrived at Valdano 4 minutes before noon and was shown to a corner table where Dominic was already seated. He stood when she came in, which surprised her. He was wearing a dark jacket and no tie, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time, with that thorough, unsentimental assessment, and she looked back at him without softening it. She sat down across from him and put her coat over the chair back, and before he could begin, she reached into her pocket and set the photograph on the table between them, face up, and waited. He looked at it. Something moved through his face fast, controlled, but not fast enough. His jaw tightened. He picked up the photograph with 2 fingers and held it, and she watched his hands, which were very still and very deliberate. The hands of a man applying a great deal of care to not showing what he was feeling. He looked at the photograph for a long time. When he set it down, his eyes came up to hers, and they were different from what they had been when she walked in, not softer. Exactly, but unguarded in a way that was clearly unfamiliar to him, the way a door looks when someone opens it from the inside. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My grandmother left it to me," Mia said, "along with a notebook." She paused. "I think you and I need to have a very different conversation than the one you planned." He looked at her across the table and said nothing, and she understood that this was agreement. He did not eat. He ordered coffee and did not drink it, and he listened to everything she told him without interrupting, which she would later understand was not his natural mode but a deliberate choice, the kind of restraint that costs something. She showed him the notebook. She read him the last entry in her grandmother's handwriting, the Italian coming slowly because she was still learning it, working from a dictionary app on her phone for the words she did not know, and his face, through all of it, was the face he wore in public, controlled, unreadably, the visor down. But his right hand was flat on the table, and she watched it the way she watched things she did not want to be caught watching. And once, when she read the line, "Rimani, amore," the tendons in the back of that hand shifted and went still again, and he said nothing, and she kept reading. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them, other tables, low voices, the sound of silverware, and it all seemed very far away, as though the 2 of them were sitting inside something the rest of the room could not reach. He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down without drinking. "Her name," he said. "Your grandmother." "Giulia," Mia said. "Giulia Mancini. Before she came to the States." Something happened in his eyes. Not the mask slipping. The mask did not slip, but something behind it. A pressure change. Like weather moving in. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, with great precision, as though the sentence required assembly, "I need to speak with my father. I think that's probably overdue," Mia said, and he looked at her sharply, and she held the look without apology. Because it was true, and they both understood that it was true. And after a moment his expression shifted into something that was not quite acceptance but was adjacent to it. He called her a car. He did not ask if she wanted one, he simply told her a car would take her home and that he would be in touch. And ordinarily she would have pushed back against the presumption of it. But she was tired, and the notebook was in her bag, and something about the way he said it quietly, without performance, as though taking care of the logistics was the only thing he currently knew how to do, with his hands made her let it go. She let herself be driven home. She sat in the back of a black car and looked out the window at Boston, going past, and thought about her grandmother at 19, standing on a seawall, and the man who had loved her enough to keep one photograph for 30 years on the ledge of a piano he sat beside every day. Dominic went to the house in Beacon Hill. It was early afternoon, grey and cold, and Lorenzo was in the garden when Dominic arrived, walking the gravel path between the dead hedges the way he walked it every day, hands clasped behind his back. The particular deliberate pace of a man using movement to hold something still inside himself. Dominic watched him from the French doors for a moment before going out. He had prepared sentences on the drive over. He had organized them by order of importance, which was also his natural mode in difficult conversations. Begin with the fact and move outward. But standing on the gravel with the cold air coming off the bare hedges, he looked at his father's face, at the 71 years in it, at the thing he had seen there during Mia's sessions, the openness, the unguarding, and every prepared sentence left him at once. "Julia Mancini," he said. Lorenzo stopped walking. He did not turn immediately. He stood with his back to Dominic, hands still clasped behind him, and the garden was very quiet, and the cold settled around them both. Then he turned. His face was the mask, fully in place. But his eyes were doing the thing Dominic had seen at the restaurant, that pressure change. The weather moving in. "Where did you hear that name?" Lorenzo said. Not a question, a measurement. "Her granddaughter has a notebook," Dominic said, "and a photograph. The one from the seawall in Posillipo." He watched his father's face. "You took that photograph." The silence after that was the longest Dominic could remember standing inside. Longer than boardroom silences. Longer than the silence after verdicts. Longer than the silences this man had specialized in for as long as Dominic had known him. Lorenzo looked at him for a very long time, and then he turned and walked to the iron bench at the end of the garden path and sat down. And Dominic followed and stood in front of him and waited. "I was 23, Lorenzo said. His voice was different, lower, the accent more present, as though the mask required energy to sustain, and he had redirected that energy elsewhere. She was in a music program at the conservatory in Naples. I was already in the family business, already past the point where I had choices about what I did with my life, but not yet past the point where I thought I might still choose some things." He looked at his hands. "We had 2 years. I was going to leave. I had made arrangements, a different city, a different name. People did such things then, when they were willing to pay enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I came home one evening and she was gone. Her rooms were empty. There was no note. I looked for 6 months and found nothing. And eventually I was told she had died in an accident on the coastal road outside Sorrento." He paused. "I was told this by my brother Marco." Dominic was very still. "He came to me with paperwork." Lorenzo continued, his voice the same, measured, almost clinical. The tone of someone who has had decades to process a wound and has processed it into scar tissue rather than healed it. "A police report, a death certificate. I did not question it because I was 24 years old and I was already learning that grief and the family business are incompatible. And because questioning Marco had consequences I was not yet equipped to manage." He looked up at Dominic. "I married your mother 2 years later. She was a good woman. She deserved better than a man who was already a ghost. I have known that for 30 years. The cold had worked itself into Dominic's coat. He did not move. He was doing what he always did with information that changed the shape of things, holding very still, letting it settle, waiting for the new shape to become visible. But the new shape here was one he had not anticipated, because the new shape involved Marco, and Marco was not a man Dominic had ever let himself fully distrust. Because Marco was the only person in the family who had ever, in Dominic's childhood, seemed to be on his side. He thought about Marco at his mother's funeral, one hand on Dominic's shoulder. He thought about Marco at his father's table, steady and reliable. Always reasonable. He thought about Marco 3 weeks ago in Dominic's office, looking at Dominic's operational files with the comfortable ease of a man who had never needed to hide his interest. He fabricated it, Dominic said, almost certainly. Lorenzo's voice was without inflection. She was alive. She had a daughter, a granddaughter. She built a life. Marco made certain I never knew. He looked at the dead hedges, at the grey November sky above them. He needed me to stay. He needed me to become what the family needed me to become. And Julia was the only thing that might have prevented it. Marco is not a cruel man by nature. He is a practical one. It amounts to the same thing. Dominic's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Ricci. He picked it up. Not now, he said. It needs to be now, Ricci said, and something in his voice made Dominic's hand tighten on the phone. We have a problem with the Calloway woman. Marco's people ran her name this morning. They must have pulled it from the household log, and there are 2 of ours outside her building as of 40 minutes ago. But they're not ours. Sir, they're Marco's. The cold became something different. Dominic was already moving, already off the garden path, one hand on his father's shoulder as he passed, not a gesture he planned, just something his body did. And Lorenzo reached up and held his wrist for 1 second before releasing it. The grip, brief and exact. 30 years of silence pressed into 4 fingers and then let go. Address, Dominic said into the phone, and Ricci gave it to him, and he was through the French doors and across the marble entryway and out the front of the house with his car keys already in his hand. He drove too fast. He told himself it was operational efficiency. A threat to a civilian associated with his household required immediate response. This was procedure. This was rational, and he believed approximately half of it. The other half was something he did not name. He had gotten very good over the years at not naming things. And this skill had served him in boardrooms and in negotiations, and in 100 situations where naming a thing changed your relationship to it in ways you could not afford. He drove through the grey Boston afternoon and did not name the thing that was making him drive this fast. He turned onto her street and saw them immediately, a dark sedan parked across from her building. 2 figures inside. The particular stillness of men who were waiting rather than resting. He parked behind them. He got out of his car. He walked to the driver's side window of the sedan and stood there. And when the window came down, he looked at the man inside with the expression he reserved for situations where he needed to be unambiguous. Tell Marco, he said, quietly, that this address is under my protection, not the family's, mine. He paused. And tell him I'd like to meet. Tomorrow morning. My office. If he decides not to come, that decision will have a cost he hasn't budgeted for. The man in the car said nothing. The window went up. The sedan pulled out and drove away. Dominic stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building, at the lit windows on the 3rd floor, and took out his phone. She answered on the 2nd ring. You're outside, aren't you? She said. He looked up at the windows again. One of them was her, he realized. Looking down at him, he felt something that was not embarrassment but lived nearby. There were men watching your building, he said. They're gone. I saw them, she said. I wasn't going to tell you. Why not? A pause. Because telling you feels like asking you to handle something, and I wasn't sure I was ready to be something you handle. Her voice was very steady. But I looked up your family name after I got home from the restaurant. Dominic, I know who you are now. I know what the Ferrante name means in this city. Another pause. Briefer, I'm going to open the door. You can come up if you want to explain what just happened, or you can stand on the sidewalk. Those are the options. The door buzzed. He went up. She was standing in the doorway of her apartment when he reached the 3rd floor. Arms crossed, wearing a grey sweater and the expression of someone who had decided in advance to be neither frightened nor impressed, and was succeeding at both. The wooden box was on the table behind her. The notebook was open beside it. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her, and he said the truest thing he had said to anyone in a very long time. I don't know yet how to explain all of it, but I will. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. He stayed for 3 hours. He sat at her kitchen table and told her things in the careful, pared-down way he told things, no excess, no performance. Just the facts in their proper order, and she listened the way she listened to music. Not just to the notes, but to what the notes were organized around. The silence at the center of it. He told her about the family. He told her about Marco, about the structure of loyalties inside the Ferrante name and how those loyalties were maintained and what it cost when they broke. He told her about his father and the 4 years of closed doors and the music room that no one entered and that Dominic had understood, without being told. Was grief made architectural? He did not tell her he was sorry for having suspected her. He said instead, looking at the table rather than at her, I was wrong about what you were doing here. I should have taken longer before deciding. It was, she understood, as close as he came. She accepted it as such. She made coffee. She told him about her grandmother, not the notebook version, the real version. The woman who had raised her in a Somerville apartment and taught her piano on a stuck-pedaled Yamaha and cooked Sunday ragu and never, in 22 years, mentioned Naples or a man whose name began with L or any life before the one she had built here. She wasn't sad, Mia said. That's what I keep thinking about. She wasn't a sad person. She was the least sad person I knew. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She must have grieved it completely, at some point, and then just decided to live anyway. I don't know how you do that. Dominic looked at her across the table and said nothing, and she realized he was thinking about his father, about 30 years of a man sitting in a music room alone, and the difference between the two ways of surviving a thing. He left at midnight. At the door he paused with his hand on the frame and said, "Don't come to the house this week. I need to deal with Marco first." She wanted to say she was not going to take instructions from him, which was true. She said instead, "Tell me when it's done," which was also true and more useful. And something shifted in his face, brief, almost imperceptible, that she filed away. She locked the door after him and stood in her kitchen for a long time, drinking the last of the cold coffee and listening to the building settle around her. The meeting with Marco happened the next morning. Dominic had chosen his own office, deliberately neutral ground in name only, since everything in the room had been selected and arranged to convey a particular set of things about who held which kind of power. Marco came alone, which was either confidence or a performance of it, and he sat across from Dominic and crossed one leg over the other and looked at his nephew with the expression of a man who had not yet decided how much to concede. He was 64, lean, silver-haired, with a face that had always reminded Dominic of a well-maintained building, impressive from the outside. All the structural work hidden. "You wanted to talk," Marco said. "I know about Giulia Mancini." Dominic said, "The well-maintained building did not collapse. It settled, slightly, the way structures settle when a load shifts." Marco looked at Dominic for a long moment, and then he uncrossed his leg and set both feet on the floor and said, "Your father told you." "My father confirmed it. I found it another way." Marco was quiet. He looked at the window. "I made a decision," he said at last, "that protected this family. Your father was 23 years old, and he was going to walk away from everything, the business, the name, the obligations for a woman he had known for 2 years. The family would not have survived it. The timing was wrong. Everything we built in the decade after that would not have been built." He paused. "I am not going to apologize for a decision that kept this family standing." "You told him she was dead," Dominic said. His voice was even. He had worked very hard on the drive over to make it even, because he understood that even was more dangerous than angry. And he needed Marco to understand the precise nature of what was happening here. "You fabricated a death certificate. You had her threatened into leaving. And then for 30 years you sat at my father's table and watched him grieve a woman you had driven away. And you said nothing." He paused. "That's not a decision about the family. That's something else." Marco looked at him. Something moved in the older man's face, not guilt. Exactly. But the particular expression of a man who has carried a weight for so long, he had stopped feeling it as weight, and is only now being asked to set it down, understanding how heavy it was. "What do you want?" Marco said. "I want your resignation from the operational board," Dominic said, "effective immediately. Your financial interests in the legitimate holdings remain yours. I'm not taking what's yours, but your seat, your access, your role in any decision this family makes going forward. That ends today." He let the sentence settle. "In exchange, this stays inside this room. Your name doesn't become a story anyone tells. You live quietly and well, and we do not have this conversation again." The silence that followed was long enough that Dominic had time to think about all the ways it could go wrong. All the ways Marco could decide that the cost of compliance was higher than the cost of refusal. Marco had people. Marco had 30 years of favors and relationships that Dominic could not fully map. This was not a simple thing to ask, and they both knew it. But he looked at his uncle's face and saw the weight coming off it, slowly, and understood that some part of Marco had been waiting, for 30 years, for someone to ask him to put it down. "All right," Marco said, quietly, without drama, the way men of his generation did the most consequential things without theater, without explanation, as though the gravity of it required less language. Not more. Marco left. Dominic sat alone in his office for a few minutes, and then he called Ricci and gave him 3 instructions in sequence. And then he called his father. Lorenzo answered on the first ring, which he never did. "It's done," Dominic said. "Mark was out. You won't have to see him at the table again." A pause on the line. Long enough that Dominic thought the call had dropped, and then his father said, in the voice that had the accent in it, the real voice, "Come to the house. Dominic, come for dinner. I'll have Rosa cook." It was the first time in 4 years Lorenzo had asked him for dinner, and Dominic said yes before the sentence was finished. He went to the house in Beacon Hill that evening. Rosa had made the Sunday ragu, which she only made on Sundays and which, therefore, on a Thursday, meant something. The table in the small dining room was set for 2, and there was wine already open, a Campanian red that Dominic recognized as something Lorenzo had been saving. And they sat across from each other and ate and talked, actually talked. Not the careful informational exchanges they had been managing for years, but the kind of conversation that goes sideways and doubles back and has weather in it. Lorenzo asked about the business, and Dominic told him things he had not shared before, not because he had been hiding them, but because no one had asked. Lorenzo listened the way Mia had described him, listening fully, without interruption, with the quality of attention that made the person being heard feel that what they were saying mattered more than what came next. Dominic thought, sitting across from him, that this must have been what he was like at 23, before the weight, before the mask. He thought about how much it cost a person to become something they had not planned to become, and how long it took to come back from it, and whether coming back was even the right word for what Lorenzo was doing now, which was not returning to something but arriving, finally, at something new. After dinner, Lorenzo went to the music room. Dominic followed without being asked and stood in the doorway while his father sat in the armchair by the window, not at the piano, not playing. Just sitting in the room, the way he always sat in it, and looked at the Busendorfer. "She will come back," Lorenzo said. "Not a question. I'll ask her," Dominic said. "Ask her to play the Siciliana again." Lorenzo said, "I would like to hear it properly this time. Not as a shock." He paused. "As a choice." Dominic sent the message that night. 1 line. No preamble. She replied in 4 words, "I'll be there Tuesday." He read it twice and then put his phone down and stood at the window of his own apartment looking out, at the city and allowing himself, for the first time in a long time, to not be certain about something and to find that uncertainty tolerable. Tuesday came cold and bright, the first clear day after a week of grey, and Mia arrived at the Beacon Hill house at 3 o'clock with her bag over her shoulder and her sheet music and the wooden box, which she had not planned to bring but had put in her bag at the last moment without deciding to. Enzo opened the door and said, "Good afternoon," which was 2 more words than he had ever said to her before, and showed her up to the music room. Lorenzo was already there, in his chair, and he stood when she came in. He had never stood before, and looked at her with the open expression, fully present, nothing held back. And she looked at him and felt the particular vertigo of understanding that you are standing inside a moment that has been 30 years in the making, and that your arrival in it was not an accident, though it looked like one from the outside. She set the wooden box on the piano. She opened it and took out the photograph, not the seawall one, Lorenzo's photograph, but her own, the garden one, the one where her grandmother was 30 and still had that posture, and set it on the ledge behind the music stand where the seawall photograph had been. Lorenzo looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out something small and set it on the fallboard of the piano in front of her. A ring, simple gold, very old, with a small oval stone that was either amber or very old tortoiseshell. And she looked at it and then at him, and he said she left it with a letter. The letter was delivered to me a year after she disappeared. I thought it was from her estate. I did not understand it was from her, still living, until much later, when it was too late to matter. He paused. It matters now. She would want you to have it. He picked it up and held it toward her, and she took it and held it in her palm and felt the warmth it had stored from his jacket and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and Lorenzo seemed to understand this perfectly. Dominic was in the doorway. She had not heard him arrive. He was leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets, watching, and when she looked at him, he looked back without the visor, without the assessment, without any of the apparatus he wore for the world, just his face, still and open and a little uncertain, which was the most she had seen from him and more than she had expected. She put the ring in her coat pocket. She sat down at the Bösendorfer and placed her hands on the keys and felt the instrument's particular quality of attention, the good piano's willingness to meet you where you are. Lorenzo settled back into his chair. Dominic stayed in the doorway. The November light came through the long windows and lay in panels on the floor between them, and the garden outside had lost all its leaves and the branches were bare and exact against the sky, the way things look after they have finished pretending. She played the Siciliana from the beginning, the same melody, the same phrasing, the same patience in it that the room seemed built to hold. She played it through completely, and when she reached the last chord, she let it fade the way her grandmother had always let it fade, not lifting her hands, but releasing slowly, the sound thinning like fog rather than cutting like a switch, and in the silence that followed, she felt the room hold it, hold all of it. 30 years of it, and 4 weeks of it, and the distance between a seawall in Posillipo and a music room in Boston, and the improbable fact of this particular afternoon with these particular people in it. She said the word, not loudly, not performing it, just saying it, the way her grandmother had said it, to no one and everyone, to the music and the room and the cold bright air beyond the glass. Rimani. Lorenzo closed his eyes. Dominic pushed off the doorframe and came into the room for the first time and stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And she did not turn around, and he did not speak, and the last of the chord's resonance moved through the air between all of them and then settled, finally, into the particular silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that does not require it.